Two people earn the exact same salary, live in the same city, and track every single penny. Yet, one ends up completely broke, while the other quietly builds a fortune. Most people blame inflation or low income, but the real culprit is a hidden psychological trap, and a single, silent daily routine that nobody is talking about. If your bank account feels like it's leaking money despite doing everything right, you aren't facing a math problem. You're facing a behavior problem. Here is the exact quiet habit that changes everything. You can spend years trying to learn the perfect investment strategy while still making impulsive decisions every week because of stress. You can understand budgeting perfectly and still overspend because buying things temporarily makes you feel in control. You can even become financially successful while secretly staying anxious the entire time because your relationship with money never actually changed. That's why the psychology of money matters more than most financial advice people hear online. Because financial success is usually not about intelligence alone. If it were, every genius would be wealthy and emotionally calm around money. But that's obviously not true. Some incredibly smart people destroy themselves financially while ordinary people with average incomes quietly build stable lives over time simply because they understand their own behavior a little better. And honestly, this is why money feels so personal. You're not just managing numbers. You're managing emotions attached to survival, status, childhood experiences, future uncertainty, and the fear of falling behind. That's why people can react emotionally to a small dip in their investments even when they logically know it's normal. That's why someone earning $150,000 a year can still feel broke while another person earning far less sleeps peacefully at night. Money is never only about money. It's about what money represents. For some people, money means safety because they grew up around instability. For others, it means freedom because they spent years feeling trapped. For someone else, it means respect because they spent most of their life feeling overlooked. And when money becomes tied to emotional needs like that, decisions stop being rational very quickly. That's the part most financial conversations ignore. They focus on spreadsheets without talking about human behavior. They talk about maximizing returns without talking about fear. They explain compound interest but never explain why people sabotage long-term goals for short-term emotional relief. And honestly, that's understandable because behavior is harder to measure than numbers. But behavior is usually the thing making the biggest difference. Think about how often people already know what they should do financially. Most people already know they should save more consistently, avoid unnecessary debt, stop impulse spending, and think long-term. The information itself isn't hidden. The difficult part is acting consistently when emotions get involved. Because emotions change the meaning of money in real time. A calm person sees a market decline as temporary volatility. A fearful person sees disaster. A patient person sees slow progress as normal. An impatient person sees failure. Two people can look at the exact same financial situation and emotionally experience completely different realities. And that's why personal finance is personal. Not because the math changes, but because people do. One of the most powerful ideas in modern financial psychology is that doing well with money has surprisingly little to do with how smart you are and a lot to do with how you behave when life becomes uncertain. That's where things become difficult because uncertainty changes people. It changes how patient they are, how impulsive they become, how much risk they take, how much they compare themselves to others. And comparison alone quietly destroys more financial peace than people realize. Because if you constantly look sideways at other people, your definition of enough keeps moving. Someone buys a larger house, suddenly yours feels smaller. Someone travels more, now your life feels limited. Someone online appears successful, now your progress feels invisible. And the dangerous part is that comparison has no finish line. There will always be someone earning more, spending more, investing more, or appearing more successful. If your emotional stability depends on keeping up with people around you, money will never feel sufficient no matter how much you earn. This is one reason high income doesn't automatically create peace. A lot of people imagine financial stress disappears once you reach a certain salary, but emotional habits often follow people upward. Someone making £40,000 worries about bills. Someone making £250,000 worries about maintaining lifestyle expectations. The numbers change, but the emotional pressure often stays surprisingly similar. Because lifestyle expands faster than satisfaction. That's something people rarely expect. When people imagine becoming wealthier, they picture comfort. What they don't picture is adaptation. Human beings adapt to improvements extremely quickly. The apartment that once felt luxurious becomes normal. The salary that once felt life-changing becomes expected. The purchase that once created excitement becomes ordinary after a few weeks. And once something becomes normal, the brain starts looking for the next thing. That cycle is endless unless you become aware of it. This is why some people spend their entire lives financially chasing emotional satisfaction that never fully arrives. They believe the next raise, next purchase, next milestone, or next achievement will finally create lasting security or happiness, but emotional adaptation quietly moves the finish line every time they get closer. The strange thing is that some of the happiest financially stable people are not the ones earning the most. They're often the people who learned how to define enough for themselves. That idea sounds simple, but psychologically it's incredibly difficult because modern culture constantly encourages dissatisfaction. Everywhere you look, there's pressure to optimize your lifestyle, increase your status, upgrade your image, and move faster financially. But constantly upgrading your visible lifestyle can quietly damage your invisible freedom. Because every increase in lifestyle creates new obligations. A more expensive car means larger payments. A larger home means higher costs. A more status-driven life often requires maintaining appearances. And eventually people discover something uncomfortable. Sometimes the things that were supposed to make them feel free actually reduce their freedom. That realization changes people, especially when they realize wealth and spending are not the same thing at all. Real wealth is often invisible. That's one of the most misunderstood ideas about money. People naturally notice visible spending because it's easy to see. Expensive watches, luxury vacations, designer clothes, large houses, high-end restaurants. But actual financial stability is usually much quieter because money that gets invested, saved, or left untouched becomes invisible to other people. You can't easily see restraint. You can't easily see patience. You can't easily see someone choosing long-term security over short-term appearance. Which means society often rewards the appearance of wealth more visibly than actual wealth itself. And that creates distorted incentives. Someone driving a luxury car may genuinely be wealthy, but they may also be heavily financed and financially stressed. Meanwhile, someone driving a normal car may quietly have years of savings, investments, and emotional peace. The outside rarely tells the full story. This becomes even more important when you realize that financial confidence and financial reality are not always connected. Some people appear extremely confident with money while secretly living under constant pressure. Others appear modest while building enormous long-term stability slowly and quietly. And honestly, slow is the part most people struggle with. Modern culture trains people to expect visible progress quickly. Fast growth. Fast success. Fast results. But most meaningful financial progress feels incredibly boring while it's happening. That's the difficult psychological reality nobody celebrates enough. Good financial decisions usually don't feel exciting in the moment. Consistently saving money isn't thrilling. Investing patiently for years doesn't create daily emotional rewards. Avoiding unnecessary lifestyle inflation doesn't impress people immediately. In fact, many good financial habits feel emotionally unrewarding at first because the reward is delayed. And human beings naturally struggle with delayed gratification. If someone offers your brain a small emotional reward now versus a larger invisible reward years later, most people instinctively lean toward now. That's why impulse spending exists. That's why people abandon long-term plans for temporary relief. That's why emotionally stressful days often lead to financially irrational decisions. Because stress narrows time horizons. When people feel emotionally overwhelmed, they stop thinking long-term and start thinking about immediate comfort. That's true financially, emotionally, and behaviorally. And honestly, this is why building wealth is often more about emotional endurance than intelligence. It's the ability to stay consistent during periods where progress feels invisible. It's the ability to avoid panicking during uncertainty. It's the ability to stop comparing yourself constantly. It's the ability to remain patient while other people appear to move faster. And patience is difficult because the world constantly rewards visible action more than quiet consistency. People celebrate dramatic wins. They rarely celebrate stability. But stability changes lives. Quietly. Over years. One of the most powerful financial advantages a person can develop is emotional control during uncertainty. Because uncertainty causes people to abandon good plans surprisingly quickly. Take investing as an example. A lot of people say they want long-term growth, but what they actually want is long-term growth without emotional discomfort. The problem is that those two things don't exist together. Long-term investing always includes periods of uncertainty. Always. Markets rise and fall. Economies shift. Fear spreads. Headlines become dramatic. And during those moments, people suddenly feel an intense urge to do something, because inactivity emotionally feels dangerous even when patience is statistically smarter. That's where psychology quietly overrides logic. People sell because fear feels urgent. People chase trends because excitement feels convincing. People take unnecessary risks because boredom makes slow progress feel insufficient. And ironically, these emotional reactions often create the exact outcomes people were trying to avoid. This is why successful long-term investing is often described as simple but not easy. The math itself is not impossibly complicated. What's difficult is managing yourself, managing your fear, managing your expectations, managing your impatience, managing your ego when things go well. Because ego becomes dangerous financially too, especially after success. When people experience financial wins, they often begin believing success came entirely from skill rather than a combination of skill, luck, timing, and circumstance. That overconfidence leads people to take larger risks than they normally would because recent success psychologically changes how risk feels. And this happens everywhere. Someone makes money quickly during a strong market and suddenly believes they've mastered investing. Someone's business grows rapidly and they assume growth will continue forever. Someone gets lucky with one financial decision and begins treating luck like a repeatable strategy. But luck and risk are always connected. That's another idea people underestimate. When you see someone successful financially, you're often seeing the outcome without seeing all the invisible variables behind it. Timing. Opportunity. Economic conditions. Personal connections. Health. Geography. Random chance. That doesn't mean hard work doesn't matter. It absolutely does. But pretending outcomes are entirely controllable creates unrealistic expectations and unnecessary shame. Because sometimes people make good decisions and still experience bad outcomes temporarily. And sometimes people make reckless decisions and get rewarded temporarily. That's psychologically confusing for human beings because we naturally want the world to feel fair and predictable. We want success to clearly equal intelligence and failure to clearly equal mistakes. But real life rarely works that cleanly. And understanding that changes how you think about both yourself and other people. It creates more patience, more humility, more emotional balance. Because once you realize uncertainty will always exist, you stop expecting perfect control over financial outcomes. Instead, you focus more on resilience. And resilience matters more than perfection. Financially resilient people don't necessarily avoid every problem. They simply build enough flexibility to survive problems without collapsing emotionally or financially. That's where savings become psychologically important beyond the numbers themselves. Savings create breathing room. And breathing room changes behavior. When someone has no margin financially, every unexpected expense feels catastrophic. Every delayed paycheck creates panic. Every mistake feels permanent. But when someone has even a modest financial cushion, their emotional relationship with uncertainty changes. They think more clearly. They make less desperate decisions. They tolerate temporary setbacks better. They gain the ability to say no to situations they hate. That's why money's greatest value is often flexibility rather than status. Flexibility to leave unhealthy environments. Flexibility to rest temporarily. Flexibility to handle emergencies calmly. Flexibility to make long-term decisions instead of survival-based decisions. And honestly, that's a much deeper form of wealth than appearance. Because appearance only changes how other people see you. Flexibility changes how you experience life. This becomes especially important when people start attaching their entire identity to money. That's another psychological trap that quietly creates anxiety even for financially successful people. When self-worth becomes connected to income, performance, or net worth, financial fluctuations begin feeling personal. A business slowdown doesn't just feel like a business problem anymore. It feels like personal failure. Investment losses feel like identity damage. Career setbacks feel like losing value as a person. That emotional attachment creates enormous stress because money is naturally unstable sometimes. Economies change. Industries change. Careers change. And if your identity depends entirely on financial performance, your emotional stability becomes fragile too. This is why emotionally healthy relationships with money require separation between self-worth and net worth. Your financial situation matters, of course. It affects your options, stress levels, and opportunities. But it should never become the sole definition of who you are. Because people who tie identity too tightly to money often sacrifice peace trying to protect image. And image maintenance is exhausting. That's why some people quietly become trapped inside lifestyles they can technically afford but emotionally cannot sustain. They become dependent on maintaining appearances because their identity became attached to success signals. The problem is that appearances are expensive. And insecurity has no budget limit. Someone insecure will always find another thing to buy, achieve, or display in order to feel temporarily validated. But external validation fades quickly because insecurity is internal. That's why emotional awareness matters financially. You need to understand what role money is emotionally playing in your life. Are you trying to feel safe? Important? Respected? In control? Accepted? Because those emotional motivations shape behavior more than people realize. A person who spends to impress may not actually care about the object itself. They may care about what the object symbolically communicates. A person obsessively saving every dollar may not simply be disciplined. They may be deeply afraid of instability because of past experiences. Money behaviors almost always have emotional roots. And once you start seeing that, people's decisions begin making more sense. Even your own. You realize why some purchases felt emotionally satisfying beyond practicality. You realize why certain financial fears feel disproportionate. You realize why earning more didn't automatically create emotional peace. Because emotional patterns don't disappear automatically when circumstances improve. Someone who grew up around scarcity may continue feeling anxious even after becoming financially stable because the nervous system remembers instability long after the environment changes. That's why healing your relationship with money sometimes matters as much as increasing your income. And honestly, healing often starts with removing shame. A lot of people secretly carry financial shame. Shame about debt. Shame about mistakes. Shame about earning less than peers. Shame about not understanding investing earlier. Shame about starting late. But shame usually makes financial behavior worse, not better. Because shame encourages avoidance. People avoid checking accounts, avoid learning, avoid planning, avoid conversations, avoid investing, avoid asking questions, and avoid facing reality because emotionally it feels uncomfortable. But avoiding reality doesn't reduce financial stress. It usually increases it. Clarity reduces stress more than avoidance does. Even difficult clarity. And this is where something important changes psychologically. The moment people stop treating financial improvement like a performance and start treating it like a skill, they become more patient with themselves. Skills improve gradually. Not instantly. Nobody expects themselves to master a language, instrument, or profession overnight. But financially, people often expect immediate competence. And when progress feels slower than expected, they assume they've failed. But most stable financial lives are built through ordinary consistent behavior repeated for years. Not dramatic breakthroughs. Not perfect timing. Not extreme discipline. Just repeated reasonable decisions. Spending a little less than you earn. Avoiding unnecessary debt where possible. Investing consistently over time. Leaving room for mistakes. Remaining adaptable. That sounds almost disappointingly simple, but simplicity is usually what survives long-term because human beings struggle to maintain extremes. Extreme budgeting often fails emotionally. Extreme investing risks often fail psychologically. Extreme lifestyles often become exhausting. Balance lasts longer. And sustainability matters more than intensity financially. One of the most underrated financial skills is learning how to stay calm enough to think clearly. Because panic compresses decision-making quality dramatically. During stressful periods, people become reactive. They search for certainty. They want immediate solutions. That's why emotional environments heavily influence financial behavior. Fear-based environments create impulsive choices. Comparison-based environments create overspending. Scarcity-based environments create tunnel vision. And social media amplifies all of this. People now compare themselves not just to neighbors or coworkers, but to millions of carefully edited financial highlight reels online. Someone sees another person retiring early at 35, buying property young, traveling constantly, or building businesses quickly, and suddenly their own perfectly reasonable progress feels inadequate. But online visibility distorts reality. You rarely see the debt, the anxiety, the inheritance, the luck, the failed attempts, the sacrifices. You mostly see outcomes. And comparing your full reality to someone else's edited outcome is psychologically dangerous. Because it creates unrealistic expectations about how financial progress should feel. Most financial progress actually feels slow, repetitive, and emotionally ordinary. Which is completely normal. The problem is that ordinary progress doesn't look exciting online. But ordinary progress is often what builds stable lives. The person quietly investing $300 every month for years may never go viral online, but 10 or 20 years later their life can look dramatically different because consistency compounds invisibly for a very long time before becoming noticeable. That's another psychological challenge with money. Compounding is difficult emotionally because the biggest rewards happen later, after long periods where results feel small. Human beings naturally underestimate exponential growth because our brains are built around immediate visible feedback. We understand linear effort more easily than delayed compounding. But compounding changes everything over time. Not just financially. Emotionally too. Small habits compound. Small financial decisions compound. Small emotional reactions compound. And eventually tiny repeated behaviors become lifestyles. That's why consistency matters more than intensity. Someone investing modest amounts consistently for 20 years often outperforms someone constantly chasing perfect opportunities emotionally. The patient person usually benefits more than the frantic person. Because patience protects people from self-destruction. And honestly, avoiding self-destruction matters more financially than people realize. A lot of long-term success comes not from brilliance, but from avoiding catastrophic mistakes repeatedly over time. Avoiding overwhelming debt. Avoiding ego-driven risks. Avoiding lifestyle traps. Avoiding panic decisions. Avoiding constant comparison. Avoiding the need to prove something through spending. That restraint may not look impressive moment to moment, but over decades it becomes incredibly powerful. And this is where the turning point usually happens for people psychologically. They stop viewing money as a scoreboard and start viewing it as a tool. That shift changes everything. Because scoreboards create endless comparison. Tools create usefulness. When money becomes a scoreboard, every interaction becomes competitive. You constantly measure yourself against others. You chase external validation. You attach emotional meaning to financial rank. But when money becomes a tool, priorities become clearer. You start asking different questions. Not, how do I look successful? But, what kind of life am I actually trying to build? That question changes financial behavior completely. Maybe you realize freedom matters more than luxury. Maybe flexibility matters more than status. Maybe calm matters more than appearances. Maybe time matters more than impressing strangers. And once priorities become clearer, financial decisions often become simpler because you stop buying things that only exist to satisfy external pressure. That doesn't mean never enjoying money. Enjoying money matters too. Life is not meant to become a punishment in the name of optimization. Experiences matter. Comfort matters. Generosity matters. Pleasure matters. But intentional enjoyment feels very different from emotional spending. Intentional enjoyment aligns with values. Emotional spending usually tries to temporarily escape emotions. And learning the difference between those two things is incredibly valuable. Because money should support your life, not become the center of your emotional identity. That's something people often understand intellectually long before they feel it emotionally. Especially ambitious people. Ambition itself is not bad. In many ways, ambition creates growth, innovation, opportunity, and improvement. But unchecked ambition without emotional balance can quietly destroy peace because the goalpost never stops moving. There's always another target. Another milestone. Another income level. Another comparison. And eventually people discover that if they cannot appreciate enough now, they probably won't appreciate enough later either. That realization can feel uncomfortable at first, but it's also freeing. Because it means peace cannot be permanently postponed until some future financial number arrives. Peace has to exist alongside progress. Otherwise progress becomes emotionally endless. And honestly, that may be one of the most important lessons in the psychology of money. Financial success without emotional stability often feels emptier than people expect. You see this in people who technically won financially but still live with constant anxiety, pressure, or dissatisfaction because internally nothing changed. They solved income problems without solving emotional patterns. Meanwhile, some people with far less money feel deeply grounded because their expectations, priorities, and emotional relationship with money are healthier. Again, this doesn't mean money doesn't matter. It absolutely matters. Financial hardship is real. Stability matters enormously. Security changes lives. But after basic security, psychology begins playing a bigger role than many people expect. That's why two people with similar finances can experience completely different levels of peace. One constantly feels behind. The other feels grateful and stable. One sees temporary setbacks as proof of failure. The other sees them as part of life. One spends reactively. The other spends intentionally. And over time those emotional differences compound into completely different outcomes. This is also why humility matters financially. Because humility leaves room for uncertainty. It reminds you that markets can surprise you, economies can shift, and luck always exists. Humility prevents overconfidence during good times and reduces despair during difficult times because you stop expecting total control over everything. And strangely enough, accepting uncertainty often reduces anxiety more than trying to eliminate uncertainty entirely. Because uncertainty is permanent. No investment is guaranteed. No career is perfectly stable. No economy stays predictable forever. Trying to remove all uncertainty from life is impossible. But learning how to emotionally tolerate uncertainty changes everything. That's real confidence. Not believing bad things will never happen, but believing you can handle uncertainty without collapsing emotionally every time life becomes unpredictable. And financially, that mindset is powerful. Because calm people make clearer decisions. Patient people avoid unnecessary mistakes. Flexible people recover faster. And emotionally secure people spend less energy trying to impress others. That's why emotional maturity quietly becomes a financial advantage. Not because mature people are perfect, but because they recover faster from mistakes and avoid turning temporary emotions into permanent consequences. At some point, most people realize money is less about reaching a magical destination and more about creating a stable relationship with uncertainty, freedom, time, and choice. That realization softens things. It removes some of the panic. Some of the comparison. Some of the pressure to constantly prove progress externally. And maybe that's the healthiest way to think about wealth in the first place. Not as endless accumulation. Not as superiority. Not as performance. but as the ability to live with more clarity, flexibility, and peace. That version of wealth looks quieter than social media usually portrays. But it's probably closer to what most people are actually searching for. The ability to sleep without constant stress. The ability to make decisions without panic. The ability to enjoy moments without financial fear controlling everything. The ability to know that your self-worth exists beyond your bank account. And maybe most importantly, the ability to stop treating your entire life like a race against everyone else. Because the truth is, there will always be people ahead of you financially. And there will always be people behind you financially. But neither group should define your life. Your relationship with money is ultimately private. It's between you, your values, your goals, your fears, your habits, and the kind of future you want to create. That's why understanding the psychology behind your decisions matters so much more than trying to appear financially impressive to strangers. And honestly, if you like thinking about money this way, where behavior matters just as much as numbers, then stay around, because these are the kinds of conversations we're going to keep having here. Because the more you understand your behavior around money, the less money controls your emotions. And that may be one of the most valuable forms of wealth a person can build.